Hi, welcome back. So this is video 7, module 3, and we're going to be dealing with something called neighborhood locality. So for this video we're actually going to be using PHP to manipulate images to bring a far more customized and personal service to the recipient of the e-zine. So in order to achieve this, we are going to use the PHP GD Graphics Library. So this is the library that contains all of the extensions that we can use in PHP to customize and manipulate and transform imagery, whether it be JPEGs or PNG, etc. So to start off, let's take a look. We're going to do it slightly differently. We're going to actually take a look at a revised version of the e-zine. So if I just flick to that. Okay, so this has got an e-zine which has just been mailed to myself. Again, it's got the same subject line that we've used before, but there's a few changes inside. So let's open up the e-zine and let's see what we've got. Okay, so the first thing that we've now got sitting here is a large image, man about Brighton. So this is another way that we're going to deepen that relationship. So George Bailey, let's look at a couple of facts about George Bailey. The first thing is he lives in Brighton. That is his city of residence. And we also know from the sales ledger that within the last 90 days he has purchased men's fashions from Jack and Jones. So what this image is doing is, one, it's giving an image of Brighton Pier. Two, it's adding a banner into that image which says, "Hey George, check out the latest from Jack and Jones." To the right we've got 3 additional product shots for Jack and Jones, and then at the bottom there we've got the word Brighton. So what module 3 is going to be doing is going to be creating these sections for men's fashions and for women's fashions only. That's all that this is going to apply to, and it is going to customize that content, that imagery, based on the last marketable brand that we have in there, which was purchased by that customer within the last 90 days, and it is going to localize it to their city or to their nearest largest town stroke city. The other thing I'm just going to show you is, because we've slightly amended the style of the email with this additional module, and therefore I've changed the script, which I'll come on a little bit later when we look at the PHP code. I've changed it so that if this module appears, if this container appears in the e-zine, then modify the branding imagery as follows. So you'll see that we've now gone to a tab scenario, for example for spring into spring into summer, rather than the large blocks that we had running down the left hand side. Similarly, the tabs follow right through for men's fashions, men's footwear, men's sportswear, boys fashions, just to give a little bit of synergy. And the reason that this is happening is because this tabbed style that we're using on this man about image, it doesn't really work if we use the old format where we had the branding running down the side. But this branding change, this style change, it only actually happens if the container man about is actually included in the e-zine. Otherwise it switches back to what we had previously. Okay, so I think what we're now going to do is let's reverse engineer all of this, and I'll show you how this is actually achieved. So the first thing that I want to start with is file structure. So we've now got a new folder set up on the site called locale. Within locale, we have a number of things. We have, and before I continue with this, obviously, I've only put in enough of the creative assets that we need to exemplify this for George Bailey, who we're continuing to use as the example for the e-zine. So we started off with a photo of Brighton, which is this one here. If we look at it, this is it. I have manipulated this in Photoshop. These two towers here are much shorter than this, but because I want to use the idea of overlaying what would be essentially some kind of billboard, some kind of marquee effect, in order to make that work, I needed to retouch the Brighton image for the pier and increase the size, probably by maybe twice the height of the original towers. So that's the base image that we're using for people, in this case George, who live in Brighton. The other thing, obviously, we've looked through the sales ledger and the PHP code, which I'll come on to later, and we've picked out that Jack and Jones was purchased. Now, Jack and Jones, it is a marketable brand. Because there are assets here in the men's fashion subfolder. So if I come in here, there it is. So here is the Jack and Jones graphics. This is what's overlaid onto that Brighton image that I just showed you. And this is all achieved with using the GD library extensions in PHP. Sitting in here in the right folder, you've got the right side of the image. So this was the image that contains some of the other product shots that we've also used in the Man About container. Okay, so let's talk about how we achieve this. And if I go back to the locale folder, here you've got a merged folder, and there's a number of things sitting in here. So you've got the left side of the image, and this was achieved using the GD library, where you can see that we've overlaid what would be the marquee stroke billboard image over the Brighton image, and we've also added text, the text that says, "Hey George, check out the latest from Jack and Jones." Obviously this would be fully customized to whatever is sitting in the sales ledger and which is a marketable asset. And I'll come on to that later. The other thing that we've got a copy of the right side image, which is also going to be used and pulled into the e-zine. And here we've got Brighton. Now Brighton was also generated using the GD extension library. So it took a base tab image and it's added the word Brighton on top. And Brighton was sourced from the main account table that we have for the customers. Okay, so let's see how we have actually achieved this. Okay, so I've created a new PHP file, local batch processing.php. So this is the file that's going to do all of the work for the graphic manipulation. This is a file which will either be scheduled to run on a regular basis using something like a cron tab, or it would be accessed via the main menu from the Toast store. So I want to run through what is the main component that we have here, the function for the GD extensions, which is all of this that we've got here in front of us. So first of all, let's talk about how many things this is actually going to do. It's going to take the Brighton image. It's then going to take the Jack and Jones, the billboard type image, and it's going to overlay that onto the Brighton image. Then it's going to take the text that we have, which was something like, "Hey George, check out the latest stuff from Jack and Jones," and it's going to overlay that onto the Brighton image, specifically into the section where we have the Jack and Jones billboard image. which has been overlaid. So there's 3 different layers to make up that Brighton image. Then what we need to do, we need to take what was the right side of that image, which was the image that had the 3 additional product shots, and we need to recreate that image, and this time we need to recreate it and call it, or give it a file name that is linked to George's account number, because that's how we're going to identify it later on when the container inserts it into that ezine. And the last thing that this function is going to do is going to take that tab at the bottom of the container image, and it's going to overlay the name of the city stroke town that George comes from, which of course in this case was Brighton. So that's what this function does in its entirety. So let's start looking at this in a little bit more detail. So to start with, if we just talk about the Brighton image and the 3 stages of that, so it's overlaying the Jack and Jones, and then it's overlaying the text. What do we need for that to actually happen? So we need to know what the city is, which is here. We're going to call this in, we're passing the city name through when we call the function, and it's going to be in the variable city. The brand is going to be passed through. So in this case, that's going to be the Jack and Jones overlaid image, the one that's like the billboard. And then we're going to have the text, and that's the text that says, "Hey George, check out the latest from Jack and Jones." So the last thing that we then need for this is going to be the merger name. So that's going to be the file name of the resulting image that we're going to save, or that this function is going to save into the folder that we were looking at earlier. Okay, so the first thing that we're doing is we need to get the size of the images that we're going to be using. So the size, when I talk about size, I'm talking about dimensions. I'm talking about the height and the width in pixels that we're going to need to process and amend and transform that image. So we have a new variable here, image source info equals get image size city. So that's going to get the image size of the variable city, which contains the pathway of the Brighton, of what is the Brighton JPG. So that is brighton.jpg, which sits, if I go back to my file structure, that sits in, let's go into email, media, back into locale, and there it is. So it's brighton.jpg. So that's what it's going to be accessing. Okay, so it's back to the script. It's also going to get the image overlay info, again for get image size for brand. So brand is going to be, let me go back to the file structure. Here we go. Men's fashions, it's this one here. Yeah. So it's going to get the dimensions, the height and the width for that image also. And it needs that because we need to be able to direct the PHP code to actually say where on the Brighton image this smaller Jack and Jones image needs to appear. And we need to give it pixel coordinates for it to actually do that. So, okay. So the next thing we need to do, we're going to create another variable called local city, and that equals something called image create from JPEG city. Again, that would be brighton.jpg. And what that essentially does, that will create, is almost like a holding space rather than an actual image. And that holding space for local city, we're actually going to populate with a new image that we're going to be transforming. Local overlay, similarly, we're going to do an image create from JPEG for brand. So that again is the billboard image for Jack and Jones we were looking at. And now we're actually going to merge them together. So we're going to do image copy here, local city, which is the brighton.jpg, comma, local overlay, which is the Jack and Jones.jpg, and then we're going to give it coordinates. So if you think about just the Brighton image on its own, the coordinates that we're given is 183 by 15. So it's going to place Jack and Jones, which is local overlay, 183 pixels to the right or across the Brighton image and 15 pixels down. And then here we just put in the additional information it needs, which is the dimensions of that Jack and Jones overlay image that it's going to be placing. So that is a variable array that we have here. So we've got image overlay info equals get image size brand. So image overlay info 0 and image overlay info 1, that's the width and the height of the actual Jack and Jones image. So that's how it knows how to actually do that overlay. So it's done that. So it's created that for us. So the next thing that we want to do, we want to put the text on the top section of that Jack and Jones billboard image. And to do that, the first thing we need to do is we need to define the color of the font. So I want black. So here we've got black, and an array equals image color allocate for local city, which is for the image that we just created here for Brighton. 0, 0, 0, which is equivalent to black. That is the color black. Then we're going to do something called image get TFT text. So we're using TTF text because we're using a TTF font, which is going to be belby.ttf for the text which would be overlaid. So we're going to do that on local city, which is the image we just transformed. So that's the image now that's got the Brighton image with the Jack and Jones overlaid on top of it. These coordinates again are going to be based on where we actually place the text, and that's going to be 188 pixels across, 29 down. Over here we've got 9, which is the font size. So that's the font size that's going to appear on that overlay. We've got the color black that the text is going to appear in, and then we've got text, which is the text that we've pulled in, which contains in that variable, hey George, check out the latest from Jack and Jones, or check out the latest from, and then Jack and Jones is actually the logo included in the image. Then we're going to create that image JPEG, which is local city, which is the original Brighton JPG, which now has the overlay on it. And we're actually going to call it and save it as merger, which is the new file name that we passed to the function when we called that function. 100 here is the quality of that image. 100 is the maximum quality that you can get. You can vary it depending upon the file size. There could be file size restrictions, but to be perfectly honest, with broadband speeds as they currently are, I think that's a bit academic. And unless you're doing a huge image, it's serious thousands of pixels dimensions, 100 is what you'd use. There's no reason to use less than the full quality. So that's created that base image for us. So if we go back to the file structure, so that has saved in the merged folder this. So this is what we've just done. Yeah. So we took the original Brighton image, we've added the Jack and Jones overlay, and then we've overlaid on top of that again a third layer, which is the text, hey George, check out the latest from Jack and Jones. So let's go back to the code. So the next thing that we're going to do, we need to get the Jack and Jones right side image, which has got the other 3 product shots, and we need to rename and copy this so that the file name actually includes George's account number, which is how we're going to link to it for the container that will appear in the eZine. So here we go. So when we call the function, we've got JPEG right side. So that is the path that actually goes to If we go into the local folder, we go into men's fashions, you go into the right folder, it's this, yeah? So this is the pathway that is going to go to jackandjones.jpg. Then we've got the new JPEG RS. Now that is the file name and the pathway for how we're going to save it. And that is where it will save it in the merged folder in here, and as you can see it's account number _2.jpg, so that's where it's going to save it, and that pathway and file name sits within here within new JPEG RS for right side, which we've carried across when we called the function. Okay, so again we've got image source info equals get image size for JPEG RS, so that is the original right size image. Local city equals image create from JPEG RS, so that's where it creates that holding space for us. And here is where we do remember we're not merging, we're not adding to this. That's all we're going to do is we're going to essentially doing a save as with a new file name in a new location, and it's image JPEG local city, which is the original JPEG RS, with a new JPEG RS, saving it with a new file name and the new pathway, and again quality is 100. So we've copied that across. How we've actually added the account number into the file name is something I'm going to come on a little bit later on when we get to the code that actually calls this function. So the last thing that we're doing is the town tab. So that was the tab that contained, here it is, George's hometown of Brighton. So let's take the code for that. So again, we need three things for this. We need the original pathway for the JPEG that just contains that blank tab with no town name on it at all. We need the new file name that is going to be saved as with the new pathway, which is going into the merged folder in the file structure. So that's this one here. And we need the town text, so we need the name of the town. Again, how we actually get the name of the town is something I'll come on to a little bit later on when we talk about how we've called this function. So it's virtually the same procedure. So again, you've got image source info, a new variable is get image size for the tab town. So we need to get the height and width dimensions for the original blank tab JPEG. Local city equals image create from JPEG tab town. So again, that's kind of creating that holding graphic with that base, with the base, the empty tab JPEG. Again, we're going to choose the color of the text that we're going to be overlaying. This time it's going to be white. Don't forget that it was like a kind of a navy blue is the tab itself, so we want this to be white text for the town name, and white text rather than 000 for black is 255 255 255 for white. Now again, we've got image TTF text, and this time we're using the font erasmd.ttf. Font size is 18. And here are the coordinates for fitting it onto or overlaying it on top of that tab, and that's 30 pixels across and 22 pixels down. So that's across starting from the left side. Color is going to be the variable $white. There's the name of the font, and this is the actual text that will appear. So it is ... concatenated with town txt, which contains the variable that contains the name of the name of George's town, Brighton. One thing you'll notice, obviously, when I talk about the fonts themselves, copies of these fonts have been saved in the same folder location that local batch processing.php is also saved in. And then here you've got the final, this is where we're going to save the revised image, the new image JPEG local city, which is the one that we created with the base that's the variable here that we created with the base tab. Dollar new tabbed town, which is its new pathway and its new file name, and again the quality is at 100. So that is the function that does all of the heavy lifting for transforming and manipulating those images. Okay, let's talk about now how we sort of brought all of the various bits and pieces together to be able to call this function with all of these variables that we're passing through. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to scroll down. So the first thing that I want to do, and I'm basing this for this example, I'm just basing this on George Bailey, who we are continuing to use as an example throughout this exercise. Obviously, when I come to phase 3, which is personal relationship as a service, we're going to have to start. That's going to be the tough part of the job, actually, because that's when we're going to start wiring it all in for all of the options, looking at all of the customers that we've got in the database, looking at all of the sales ledgers, the men's fashions, the women's fashions, and so forth. But for the purposes of this particular module that I'm showing you now, we're going to stick with George Bailey. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to select account number from master account, the master account table, where mailable equals Y. So that's going to bring out all of them. Don't forget, we've only got 2 accounts sitting there at the moment, and one of which is George. So it'll bring up 2. Then we're going to do an associative array. This is all stuff that you know that we've done before. Mailable account equals the account number. Gender, we need to know gender, because don't forget that this particular container is going to be based on either men's fashions or women's fashions only. We're not dealing with children's clothes or with junior clothes, just with men's fashions and women's fashions, and those are the only categories that this container is going to actually affect. So we're going to need to know the gender of the account as well. Obviously, we need to know the town here. That's all important piece of information, which is held within address underscore 4 in the master account table. So that's how we actually pull up Brighton. Okay. So now I'm just going to come down here. I'm going to skip right down here. Okay. And now we are going to do another select. So we're now going to whip through all of the accounts that have been selected. In this case, it's 2. And we're going to do another selection based on that. And we're going to join. We're going to do a table join. So we're going to use the master account to get further information, and we're going to use the master ledger because we need to find out what was the latest brands that person bought within 90 days, and then we'll be able to double check and find out if they exist within the file structure that we looked at earlier, and if they do, that makes them marketable assets for the container. So we are selecting for master account the account number, the first name, which we need. Obviously we need to know it's George because we use George in the graphic text that we just looked at. Master account gender, address 4. Master ledger is going to give us, for the account number, the category, because we're going to need to select only for men's or women's fashions. The SKU, because we need the SKU number, because we're going to need to check that the items that we're advertising within the container graphic, George hasn't already bought them, because we don't want to advertise something he's already bought. So we need to know what the SKU is and who the SKU supplier is. So in the case of George, this is going to be Jack and Jones. This is from master account, master ledger, where master ledger dot account number equals mailable account $I, which is the variable array that we pulled up before this particular select. So that's from these guys here in this select. And where master account dot account number equals master ledger dot account number, we have to do that every time that you're joining tables. You know that you need to do that, otherwise you will end up with a double number of results than you actually need. And where master ledger category equals men's fashions, or master ledger category equals women's fashions, and epoch time is time minus 90 days. Okay, so now in theory we've got really all of the information that we need to continue to format the variables and create those variables and clean up those variables in order to issue a call to the function to create those images from using the GD library extension. Okay, so what we want to do is now we want to check that, or what we want to do, we want to cycle through, we want to loop through all of the supplier SKUs, or the SKU supplier names, and we want to verify whether or not they exist in the file structure. So if we go back to the file structure here, okay, we're going to locale. So this is the file structure we're talking about, and we're particularly talking here for George for men's fashions. So it's going to be looking in here to see essentially, does Jack and Jones exist? If Jack and Jones does exist as a JPEG, then it's a marketable asset. If not, it'll loop through all of the other instances of SKU supplier names that George has purchased in the last 90 days to see if it exists. If there's nothing that exists that he's purchased, it means that all of his purchase at the moment, we're not regarding them in campaign terms as marketable assets. So the container wouldn't actually appear in the ezine, but in this case we know that Jack and Jones does appear. So let's go back to the code and see how we do this. So we're creating some new variables. So here we've got campaign account number $I. These are associative arrays from the select statement we just went through. And it's just pulling up the information that we talked about here, and I'm just bringing them into variable arrays so that we can now start to check if those JPEGs actually do exist. So this is the line I really want to talk about now here, which is for each glob, and then I put in a pathway, and here I put the pathway as email, media, local, men's fashions, and then we have got a wildcard sitting in there. And that wildcard is going to be populated under the variable men's fashion file name $I. So what that is essentially going to do, it's going to look here, it's going to come into this folder, it's going to look in there, is there a JPEG? Yes, there is. It's Jack and Jones, and it will put all of them. So in here, in theory, we could have Jack and Jones, you know, we could have something by Boss, there could be something from Levi, there could be a whole number of images sitting in here. And what this is going to do is going to create a variable array that contains all of those that are applicable in men's fashions. In this case, there's only one, which is Jack and Jones. So men's fashion file name $I is going to be the, let me just quickly go back, it's going to be Jack and Jones underscore MSC 00785.jpg. And obviously that MSC 00785, that is the SKU for this particular item, which is a suit jacket. So let's go back in here. Now what we're going to do, we're going to take, let's pretend that there were in fact several images in there. There was a billboard graphic for Boss, there was one for Levi, there was one for Adidas, whatever. Now we're going to implode all of those. So we're going to implode the variable array men's fashion file name $I. I've just realized I've spelled that wrong, and it's fashion, not fashion. Never mind, let's continue. It's going to implode it into one line rather than an array, and it's going to use the pipe delimiter here. So rather than explode, which is what we've done in previous videos, this is going to implode. So it'll be a string that contains, for example, it will contain the Jack and Jones file name .jpg, pipe symbol, and then it will have the boss .jpg, pipe symbol, and so forth. In this case, obviously, there's only one graphic. This is the Jack and Jones JPG, so there's only one thing to implode. Now what we're going to do, we've got the same thing going on for women's fashions. Obviously, I'm just going to gloss over this. It's exactly the same for the men's fashions. The only difference is we've changed the pathway here. But obviously we're basing it on George Bailey, so we're only interested in looking at the men's. So now what it does here, it outputs how many marketable assets there are. So in this case, for women's fashions marketable assets, it's 0. There are none. There's nothing that's sitting within the women's fashion folder. Within the men's fashion folder, we've got the Jack and Jones JPEG. So that's going to be men's fashion marketable assets is 1. Okay. So now what we need to do, we need to start creating the pathways which are being used in the call to function. So that's the information that we were looking at earlier on. Let me just refresh your memories. Here we go. So that is all of these here. Yeah. So that is the city, which was Brighton JPG. It's the brand, which is the Jack and Jones billboard image. It's the text that sits on top of that image. It's the merger, which is the file name and the pathway for essentially for the save as for the new transformed image. The merged image. Then we've got the JPEG RS and the new JPEG RS, which is for the right side of the image. And then we've got the tab that we overlay the image of the town name on. So all of that information. So now we need to look at how we're actually going to create the content for these variables that we're going to use for the call to function. So I'm going to come down here. Okay. So right. So the first thing that I'm going to do a string replace, a new variable, JPEG name, string replace, and here we're going to take the SKU supplier. So in that case it's Jack and Jones. Now that's from the database. Let me just quickly go into that database. Okay, so I've gone into the master ledger table, and what you'll notice in the SKU supplier field, we have a space, so it's Jack space and space Jones. Now the problem is we need to, obviously this is going to be a pathway, and in terms of the file pathway, the Jack and Jones has Jack underscore and underscore Jones. So that is why in the code we are doing the string replace. So we're replacing those spaces with underscores for the name Jack and Jones. Then we create another JPEG name 2$i, and this is string to lower, and it's basically changing the whole of the Jack and Jones into lowercase. I mean, the file structure that we use for this, everything is lowercase, and if it's a Linux setup, that you're using, it is very case sensitive if you're using Apache, and that's why I always use that as best practice to change it to a string to lower. Then what we're doing here for the right side image, we're doing exactly the same thing. So that is the image that's got the 3 additional product shots sitting on them. So we want to change it string to lower. again, and we also want to do exactly the same thing. The spaces between Jack and Jones need to have underscores, and I've tagged on a .jpg at the end. So that's given us the actual names that we're going to use for the actual file name .jpg. Now we're getting gender specific, so everything that I'm telling you here is relating to if the gender is male. Exactly the same it will happen if it's female. It just follows a different if statement in that instance, because obviously if it is a female, it's going to be saving images and using images within the women's fashions folder, not the men's fashions. So here we go. So here we have the if statement. So if campaign gender equals M for male, we're going to do the following. JPEG check, a new variable, equals email media local men's fashions.jpg name $i.jpg. So that is the Jack and Jones. JPEG second check glob email. That we use glob because that allows us to use a wildcard. Email media local men's fashions campaign SKU supplier dot asterisk for a wildcard. I'll come on and say how we're using these in a moment. Directory is email media local men's fashions JPEG name 2 $i dot asterisk for a wildcard. And then we've got folder directory equals email media local men's fashions right, which is for the right side image, JPEG right side $i. And then we've got new folder directory equals email media locale merged. So this is where it saves it into, which is the merge folder in the merge pathway, which is the campaign account number underscore 2.jpg. So if you remember, if I go back and we look at the right side image within the file structure, here we go, go in here, email, media, locale, go into merged. So if you remember here, the right side image is the file, the account number underscore 2.jpg. So that's where this happens here on new folder, email media, locale, merged, and then you've got the account number underscore 2.jpg. Then we've got the tab directory. So the tab directory is the pathway that we're going to be using for the base of the tab. So that's the empty tab without the tab name written on top of it, and that's email media locale tab bluebase.jpg. So if I just go into the local directory, tabbase.jpg is this one, and as you can see it's empty, there's no name on it. And then we have a new tab directory, which is email media locale merged campaign account number underscore t.jpg. So that is the final merged one, which will contain, if I just pick it up here, here it is. So it's account number underscore t.jpg, and that's the tab that we've merged, or we've overlaid the text of the town name on. So this is giving all of the information that we need to pass through, or most of the information now that we're going to need to pass through for the call function. Okay, so the one thing that we need to check is, does the file exist? If it, as in, does it exist in the sense that we're checking whether or not George has already purchased the product, in which case we don't want to use the container. So that's where we do it here, and that's what we do with the JPEG check. So if we come back up here, here we go. So we're just checking, and the JPEG names that contains the SKU that was purchased. We've already put that into that variable, so that's the SKU that was purchased. So it's checking against the file name that's sitting in the folder that we're using for Jack and Jones, and saying, does that already exist? If it does for Jack and Jones, it means George has already purchased the item, so we wouldn't want to continue. If it doesn't exist, so the if statement says if doesn't file exist JPEG Jack, then he didn't purchase that project. We can continue. Okay. So the last thing that we're doing here is we're creating Supply Jpg equals glob directory. So that's what it is doing, a check on here, and it's using a wildcard. So it's checking for JPEG name 2 $si dot wildcard here, and if we come back up, I'm going to show you what JPEG name 2 is. So JPEG name 2 is string to lower, string replace, campaign SKU supply in this case, so it's Jack and Jones, and it's just replaced the spaces with the underscore that we need for the file name. So that's just doing that final check now to make sure that the graphic here actually does exist, and that's going to be that one there. Yep. Okay. And then what we're going to do a town directory equals email media locale campaign towns.jpg. So we know the campaign town is pulled up for George from the master account table, and that's going to be Brighton. So that's brighton.jpg, and that is the base photograph that we have here, brighton.jpg. So that's the untransformed version. And then I'm going to come back to the code. We've got the merged pathway. So this is where it's going to transform the image. It's going to take the base Brighton image. It's going to add the Jack and Jones image. It's going to add the third layer, which is the text, and then it's going to save it in the pathway email media local merged campaign account number $i.jpg. And if we go back here into the merged folder, there it is. So it's George's account number.jpg. Okay, so the last thing that we're doing a final check here with an if statement. We're saying if file exists, town directory, and supplier JPEG 0 does not equal nothing. It's just a final check to make sure that all of these variables we talked have been populated. Then what it does, it calls the function. So it's calling create local image, which is the name of the function, and here it's putting all of those variables, yeah, including the text, the pathways, the here we go, for all of these assets. So we're talking about for the Brighton image, we're talking about for the right side image, and we're talking about at the end here for the tab, which also contains the campaign town. So it's pulled together all of these variables, and this then is being passed to the function at the top, and it creates the image for you. So if we're now using this within personal relationship as a service, it could have created several hundred images which can be used for several hundred customers with a valid container which you will add to those e-zines. So that's how we use the GD extension library. It is a little bit complicated, I know. There's a lot of variables in play. There's a lot of different database fields in play. There are some very complicated directory pathways and file names in play. But if you need to, certainly take another look at this video. It's actually a very simple process. It's slightly complicated for me because we're doing several things within the same function. We're actually creating 3 different images rather than just one. So as I said, local batch processing.php is something you could do in a cron tab, or it's something that you can do from your main menu in the store. So if I now go in here to TOS, now I've upgraded TOS management, as you can see. So I've made it a little bit prettier. I've added at the top the send ezine button there, and I've added here at the bottom local batch processing. So that's where it will actually do that for me. So one of the things I'm now going to do, I'm actually going to run local batch processing so you can see it working. So the first thing is I'm going to go into the file structure. Okay, so I'm going to take these images and select them. I'm going to delete all three of them. There you go. So that folder is now empty. And now I'm going to run local batch processing, and so what this should do is should transform and recreate those three images, and it should resave them back into that merged folder. So there you go, it's done. So let's go and take a look, and there they are, they're back in there, the three images that we're going to use. So you know that that file, the local batch processing.php, you know that works, and I've shown you how it's done. I mean, as I've said previously, the level that this is targeted at, this isn't for beginners. This is for sort of medium, sort of mid-ranged to advanced PHP programmers, coders. But you know, certainly rewind it and sort of, if you need to, and take another look at how we've actually achieved using the GD library extensions to manipulate those images. Okay, so let's now talk about the module. So I've set up a new file, pasmod3 landmarking.php. This is a lot simpler than the local batch processing.php, and it's based on the files for the other two modules that we've already done. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come down here. Okay. And it does a check, and the check it's going to do is if file exists, and it goes email media locale merged account holder.jpg, and file exists local merged account holder underscore 2.jpg, then it will create the container. So it's looking to see, does George's Brighton image exist, and does the right side image exist? If it does, it stands to reason that also the tab image will exist with the name of his town of Brighton on it will also exist. So we can continue and we can create that container. So the container is called container LND, and this follows exactly the same process that we have in the previous containers. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but it's just HTML, and it's just containing the image pathways that we're using. So again, you know, we're talking about media locale merged account holder.jpg and so forth, and obviously these are all clickable, just like the rest of the images that we use in the ezine. Because this does follow the same format as the other two modules we've already done, I'm not going to go through that in detail. It's exactly the same process. Okay, so the other changes that I made, obviously for this, is in send newsletter modular.php, and this I needed to do a couple of things. So the first thing I talked about was how if this container exists, so if the container for Man About Brighton for the locale exists, then we want to change the style of the ezine. So we wanted to do away with the long vertical graphics for spring into summer and the category names, and we wanted to go to a tab-based system instead, but only if the locale container exists. So let's take a look at how we've actually done that. So the first thing that I did was I went down into all of the sections that create the HTML coding for the different sections of the e-zine, and I doubled up on them. So okay, so here we've got men's fashion. We've got the original men's fashion, which is with the old style, the blocky style, that's got the vertical banners running down the side saying spring into summer, and men's fashion, men's footwear, etc. And then we've got a new one here, which is fashion, and I've added opt2 at the end. So we've got a new variable containing adjusted HTML that replaces those graphics with the tabs. I won't go into too much detail about the HTML, it's very basic stuff. And obviously I do that for all of the sections, all of the categories, so that they will appear correctly within the e-zine. This change only happens if if the locale container containing Man About Brighton actually exists. Otherwise the old style is retained, the old blocky style is retained. Okay, so if we look at men's fashion NL here, so this is the original HTML that inserts that line of 4 product shots for the men's fashion. I've created a second variable which contains the new styling in HTML coding, and it's men's fashion NL opt2, and that's all that does. It replaces the blocky vertical branding that we've used for labeling such as men's fashion and spring into summer, and it's changed it to the tab style. So how do I use that? So I've created that basically for every single category that we have, because we want it all to follow the new tab style, and then we use it here, we swap it out as follows. So if container LND, as in does that container exist, then men's fashion NL equals men's fashion NL opt2, and the same women's fashion NL equals women's fashion NL opt2. So that substitutes the old style for the new tab style. And further down, obviously we want to do this for every other category. So I've limited it here to what we're using for the example, but as personal relationship as a service, this would be for all categories across men's, women's, juniors, girls and boys categories. But here you've got aspiration NL equals aspiration NL opt2, same for men's footwear, same for men's sportswear, same for boys fashion, if container LND, so if that container actually does exist. And I've just added container LND here to the newsletter, so if it is populated and container LND exists, that container will appear on the retail e-zine. So let's just take a quick look at that again. Here it is. So it's substituted the old style for the new. So here we've got Man About Brighton, we've got spring into summer in tabs, and we've got the tabs for men's fashion, men's footwear, men's sportswear, boys fashion, selected just for you, for the boys, kids and back to school. Okay, so this is the most complex module that we've done so far. The next one is going to be using JavaScript for slideshow, but I will also probably revisit this one to maybe clean it up a little bit, and I think local batch processing.php could be a lot more elegant than it currently is, so I will come back and take a second look at that. Thanks for watching.